Welcome to today's edition of the Church Builder Podcast. So glad to have you with us again. Hope these are a blessing to you, and it's good to have back with me today kind of a regular guest here on the Church Builder Podcast. Pastor Robert Barriger is in town from Lima, Peru, and so we're going to take advantage of having him with us and talk today about some things that are important to church life. Robert, good to have you.
Greetings, and good to be back. I love this podcast. I loved catching up, especially on the last couple podcasts. They were amazing.
Thank you so much. It's been a joy to do them. We're going to talk today, Robert, about something I think is really near and dear to your heart because you're involved right now in a lot of church revitalization in Central and South America, especially as well as in Europe with your Hacienda Iglesia. And part of that whole process of sharing with pastors, revitalizing churches is centered around a very important topic. That's the topic of leading change.
Yeah. The whole process of helping church revitalize is they have to change. Don't be afraid to change actually is our first step. Mm-hmm. And that has to deal with a little bit of shock and awe. Mm-hmm. We say, things like quit defending what doesn't work. God really wants your church to grow.
Right.
If the church is his bride, it's his body, it's his mouthpiece in the world. It's the vehicle that he uses to get the gospel message into the world, then, some people may think, well, our church is small, but we're deep. Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, but God loves more than the 50 people you have in your city. Mm-hmm. And if he loved it enough to die for it, then we should love it enough to reach it for him.
To live for it, right?
So that's the first step. And then once we finally get a church, okay, we want to make changes, but where do we begin?
Yeah.
What's the first step? How do we make changes without losing people along the way?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Where do we go from here? And what should we change first?
Right.
So that's called leading change.
Yeah, and so one of the things that I have noticed over the years is that all of us in our organizations, relationships, every part of life, we tend to kind of go toward status quo. We get to that place to where everything's sort of nice and settled, and then because it's nice and settled, we get comfortable in it. And part of what we don't realize is that over time, what is status quo transitions from status quo to decline. And so a lot of churches had that experience. And I think in a lot of the churches you're working in, you're now seeing a lot of pastors taking some initiative and change and seeing some pretty amazing results, right?
Yeah, we are. We have seen so far, as of the recording of this, we're about 1,200 churches we're mentoring right now. And the average growth we've seen in these churches, mostly in Latin America, a little bit in Spain, the average growth is about 61%.
Wow.
So it's fun to see that. It's fun to see a church get excited again, dream again. Mm-hmm. You mentioned status quo. Status quo means don't change anything.
Right.
And we say it this way, that today's status quo was yesterday's revelation.
Wow.
But it's tomorrow's prison.
My goodness. Mm-hmm.
If you don't continue to evolve and grow, because no church can say we've arrived.
Right.
We're all still in that journey of getting better and becoming better. And the world, as the world changes, then that forces the church to change.
Yeah. I think one of the things about the idea of the world changing and, of course, it having impact upon the church, a lot of people say, my goodness, we shouldn't let the world drive what's happening in the church. And that's not what you're saying, is it?
No, I think it was Rick Warren that said it this way, that if the world outside changes faster than the church inside, that's the fastest path to irrelevance.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
Because we have a message that is so important.
Right.
The world needs it, but if we're speaking that message in a language the world doesn't understand, then we're not going to reach the world.
I was often thought about the fact that to be a missionary, anytime you go to a missions assignment, wherever that country or nation might be, the first thing that you experience as a missionary is called language school, right? And language school is you're going to be impossible to share the gospel in a different culture, especially a culture with a different language, unless you actually learn the language. You don't expect the people of that country to learn your language. You go in and learn theirs. I think as a church, sometimes we kind of are expecting the world to understand the gospel, and we don't put it in terms that they can actually understand their language. And not that the message changes, but the methods of communication change.
Exactly. Missionaries are what I call cultural translators. And there are people that actually understand when they say this is what they mean, and they we can speak their language.
Right.
But it goes beyond just language. We know what their gestures mean, how they are. And the world has a language, and we want the gospel to penetrate that. So we've got to speak it in a way that's understandable.
And getting very practical about this, what are some of the things that you help pastors think about as you're leading them through this process of making changes that reach the next generation, that begin to open up people to understanding the gospel in the terms that make sense to them? What are some of the practical things that make a difference in a church that helps them to begin that process of coming out of maybe a stuckness from the past and beginning to be more relevant for their present and hopefully for the future?
I remember recently, I think it was in Mexico, a pastor asked me this question that they said, what is the biggest hindrance to change?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer is, it's fairly simple. It's yesterday's success.
Wow.
Because if yesterday had success, then we look back to the way it was, the good old days, and we're trying to recreate what happened in the 80s or in the 90s. But that was for them. That was for that time. And the way we reach today's generation, the Generation X and beyond, millennials, is a different method, different message. Like you said, we're not changing, but how we do it. So if yesterday you had success and are trying to keep reproducing that, instead of how can we look toward the future and reach what the next generation is into? See, in the past, in the 80s, they didn't have internet. They didn't have the technology we have today and everything at their fingertips like we have today.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So it's a different world.
And when it comes to dealing with a different world, there has to be a different approach at times. And so I know that you're dealing with churches that have had to make adjustments to things like their service times and the length of time for a service and a variety of things, that music and those elements that are very practical in nature that actually connect with a new generation of kids, that young adults that are also very much the same around the world compared to in times past.
Exactly. We talk about that, for example, in Argentina, they had the 80s revival, where the typical revival was close all the churches in a city down for 15 days and go to a stadium, 4.5 hour services. And the goal was to cast out demons, see angels. So now in Argentina, you'll go to church and they're still trying to reproduce those 4.5 hour services, praying to see an angel. I remember I had a pastor in Argentina said to me, well, we've seen angels. And I said, do you want to see angels or kids saved?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And he said, we like to soak in the Holy Spirit. And I said, well, yeah, your generation did, but the next generation is different. And in a moment of honesty, his wife came to me and she said, Pastor, help us because our kids love God but hate church.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, that's exactly what we're talking about.
Right. So to make the church attractive, not in the sense of compromise or in the sense of changing the message, but begin to change the language, the approach, the fact that the attention span of people is much shorter today than it used to be, that people are oriented toward visuals far more than they used to be in terms of things like video and those elements of communication, that our churches have to change. What are some of the biggest obstacles? You mentioned one obstacle to change being yesterday's success, but what are some of the other things that you run into when you talk about the topic of change with people who are in church leadership?
One of the biggest areas that we run into is what we call generational leadership. I think there's a statistic, and you probably know this better than I do, that a pastor can reach a window of 10 years before you and 10 years older than you. And we'll notice as we get older, we have more gray hair in our congregation, less youth. So one of the obstacles is actually to reach younger, to gather that youth around you, to actually do service that attracts them. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the older people say, well, we want to go back to sing our choir or chorus that we used to sing. And I tell them, we sang that for 30 years, but look at your grandkids. They love this music.
Right.
And what grandpa doesn't want to see his grandkids passionate for God at the altar? Or what father doesn't want to see their kids passionate for God? And it's like that pastor's wife that said, our kids love God but hate church. Well, put a little focus on what do the kids listen to? What do they like? We don't compromise the holiness of the message and the power of the gospel. But the way it is presented could be presented in a way that's actually attractive to them.
Yeah, because the kids really aren't saying that they actually hate church. They're just hating the way church is being done. And so it's not a matter of hating church, really, because when we see, for example, at Camino de Vida in Lima, your church there, and it's packed with young people who love church, okay? Your grandkids that love church, your kids that love church. And so it's not that church is a bad thing. It's perhaps the way that people think about it and trying to force a new generation into the old patterns of past generations.
Yeah, we say sometimes we sin by making church boring for our kids.
Wow.
Why would we obligate our kids to go to a church that is even boring to us at times? You know,
Right.
there has to be a dynamic side, a more agile side, because of that's the way society is. They're constantly getting information and the fast-moving society, and we can present the gospel in a way that's attractive to this next generation, that leans toward them. And I find it actually for the older people in the church, after a while, after they quit complaining, they start to like it.
Right.
You know, they start to actually enjoy the younger, what we can call a vibe in a church.
Right.
And they couldn't go back to that old traditional, what they came out of, or that old, what they were trying to hold on to.
Yeah, I think it's a turning point in our church thinking involved just really accepting the fact that those of us who knew the Lord and were moving into the older ages of our lives, we have to accept the fact that we now have a mission to the next generation. We're saved, we're going to heaven, we know what's going to happen to us. And so the issue for us is no longer just bless me, make me feel good when I come to church, but what now can we do that makes the investment of our kids and our grandkids valuable for the future? So I think anybody, when you think of it that way, you're like, oh, it's not something being taken away from me. It's now me being on a mission to help reach a generation that has not been reached. So I'm a part of the answer here. I'm not just the problem. I'm a part of the answer. And so we as the older generation have something very valuable to offer, but we offer it by helping serve and minister to that generation coming under us.
So good. Exactly. It's that saying that we've all heard it said, the church is always one generation away from extinction.
Right.
And if we can bury the message in one generation and never reach down to the next, then we failed.
Let's talk a little bit about maybe to some pastors that are listening today, people in responsible leadership positions in churches that might be listening, just the average everyday church member, if you will, that are going to church today. Let's talk about some of the things that get in the way that we need to kind of shove out of the way to say, you know what, let's go after this next generation. What are some of these obstacles to change, or I might say processes of change that we need to embrace? What would you say to a pastor if you were sitting with them today and says, you know what, your church is plateaued and now you're at status quo and maybe you're starting to kind of decline even a bit if you'll recognize it? What advice would you begin to give to that pastor?
There's a couple things. Number one, go slow with change. We say go slow to go far.
Good.
You don't need to change everything at once.
Yeah.
Just what's the next thing you can change that would make your church better next Sunday?
Good.
One thing, go slow. Take the people on the journey with you.
Good.
Which generally means sitting down with the parents or the grandparents and explaining to them why you're doing what you're doing. It's not the how, it's the why. So we want to get them with, the reason we're doing this is you all have children, you have grandchildren, and we know how to reach them. Can you get on this journey with us to make this a place where your kids enjoy coming?
Yeah.
Because you and I both know if a family moves to a new city and they're church shopping or they're looking for a new church home, the parents will always go to where the kids go.
Yes.
If they find their kids enjoy the Sunday school or enjoy the youth group or enjoy the youth in that church, that's where they want to go back.
Yeah.
So why does that church have to be another church? Why can't it be our church?
Absolutely. And it can be.
It can be.
It really can.
It should be every church.
So it's that waking up to what really needs to start changing in our culture, what needs to be started changing in our environment. And so I think the first step is really with the culture, and we've talked a bit about that on our podcast, but it's a word that keeps coming back up again. It's very valuable for us to understand. And so are we making places for the next generation to have responsibilities and learn leadership and take those kind of roles on? Are we creating an environment that's welcoming to them? Are we really even thinking about them when we're planning our services? Those are all the elements that go into it, correct?
Exactly. And it goes even simpler than that.
Okay.
I've heard you say, if you want to know what attracts youth, just go to the mall.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because they're good at attracting youth
Right.
to those malls. And if we go to our building where we're meeting on Sunday and it has that old traditional look, it could be that the kids just say it's not a cool place to go.
Right.
So if you go to the mall, look around a little bit. Sometimes the paint color could help a little bit.
Right.
Sometimes a little bit of decoration. Just something simple. It doesn't have to make it look like a disco or something, but
Right. Sure.
just make it look like a place that kids say, this is cool.
Yeah.
I like being here.
Absolutely. As a part of this whole thing, it's important too to make sure you mentioned a moment ago, and I want to come back to it, changing the right things. And so it's not just a matter of creating a list of let's just repaint the walls. You can repaint the walls and still have an old culture, if you will, that all we did was paint the walls. And so what you want to make sure that you're doing, as I heard you say a moment ago, is to go after the why before you try to deal with the what. Expand on that a little bit.
Exactly. It's the secret sauce, the culture in a church. It's how do you get that culture, that attractive culture that actually attracts people to you? Because culture can either repel people or attract people, or just they could feel neutral, sterile. But that culture, it's hard to explain, but it's easy to identify when you see it. When people come to church, are they happy? Do they greet you? Is this an environment that's healthy? Are families there? I don't know.
Well, it's a culture that really is. I think when I think about culture, here's one of the things I think about, Pastor Robert. I think about Jesus, for example, when he would be in an environment, anytime it spoke of children being in an environment, they always ran to him because there was something about who he was, that the culture of his being that attracted that new generation. And so I think that we can create environments in our church that say that we care about you, we care about, and we love you. We want you to be here. We're not pushing you out the door, and we're welcoming you. We're opening opportunities for you. And so it's extremely important that when it comes to change, we're not just changing the externals in terms of just the superficial things, but really at the heart level, we say what we want to do is be a church that really reaches the next generation. And it really doesn't matter if you're 30 or you're 80. If you have that kind of spirit about you, it'll be an attractive place.
Yeah. You and I have both seen so many who will go to a conference and they saw this new cool worship group. So they come back and they're wearing skinny jeans and jumping around the platform like that group. But the culture is still not healthy.
Right.
It's not copying a style. It's creating an environment that people want to be in.
Exactly.
It's positive. It's encouraging, growth-orientated.
Right. When you're doing this, and with this we'll conclude today, Pastor Robert, and then we'll continue on with our next podcast together on some topics like this. But when it comes to just the kind of changes that start to attract that next generation, as you said a moment ago, as you've been doing these roundtables in South America and Central America, you are seeing life come to dead churches, aren't you?
We are. Yes, there's nothing more exciting. We say it this way, it's hard to follow a parked car.
Yes.
And it's really sad when you see a ministry or a pastor park his car.
Yeah.
I'm tired. Oh, this has been so hard. They just park it. It's hard to follow it.
Yeah.
But when you get excitement and when you get that car back on the road and people are dreaming again, the future is going to be exciting. And they're actually planning and programming for future and vision. It creates its own excitement culture. And that culture creates momentum.
Yes.
And momentum is one of your best friends.
Absolutely.
So what we try to do is just get them to dream again.
Yeah.
And then when they see one small win, that encourages them to go to the next one.
Exactly.
And then the next small win pretty soon begins to snowball and they get more wins. And then they've got momentum again.
Of course, it goes right back to what the Bible says in Proverbs 29:18, without vision, people perish. But I always like to say the opposite of that is also true. With vision, people flourish.
Exactly.
And so when you get a vision, and that's my prayer, and I think our prayer today as any pastor listening as a part of today's podcast, may God revitalize your vision. May God revitalize the fact that your best days are not behind you. Your best days are in front of you, that there's something that God wants to birth of a fresh vision and dream in your heart and life to say, you know what, we're going to make a difference. We're not going to have a church that just comes to its end and sort of slips away into oblivion, but we have something to live for until Jesus comes back again. So, Pastor Robert, thank you so much for being with us on today's podcast, and thank you all for listening. We'll look forward to talking to you again and sharing with you again on our next edition.